I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx, published 1865. The key idea of this pamphlet is, well, as the introduction explains, Value, Price, and Profit was an address delivered by Karl Marx at 2 sessions of the General Council of the First Internationale in 1865, arguing for the benefits and consequences of fighting for higher wages. Similarly to Wage, Labor, and Capital, Marx delivered the speech that makes up Value, Price, and Profit while he was writing Das Kapital. So this pamphlet serves as an interesting preview into the ideas that influenced that famous text. Now, as you can see from the book cover, this text is a double feature. This is 2 pamphlets, Wage, Labor, and Capital, and Value, Price, and Profit. I covered Wage, Labor, and Capital in my previous video, so if you didn't happen to catch that, go to the first video and check it out. But with that said, let's take a look at Value, Price, and Profit. The speech that makes up this pamphlet is primarily a critique of John Weston's theories about wages. The purpose of Marx's address was to answer the following questions. Will the material conditions of the working class be improved by increased wages? And will those increases harm workers in other industries? In the era of the $15 an hour minimum wage protests, such questions are pretty relevant. Basically, some folks thought that increasing wages for workers in one industry would harm workers in other industries by making their commodities more scarce or more expensive. Marx summarizes his opponent's argument thusly. The address Citizen Weston read to us might have been compressed into a nutshell. All his reasoning amounted to this. If the working class forces the capitalist class to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 shillings in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return, in the shape of commodities, 4 shillings worth instead of 5 shillings worth. The working class would have paid 5 shillings for what before the rise of wages they bought with 4 shillings. Like, if the market wants employees of the dog toy industry to make 10 dog toys at $5 an hour, and the workers demand $10 an hour, then this will necessarily jack up the price of dog toys so that I could not afford as many as I wanted, or the capitalist owner will be forced to decrease the hours of production so that there will not be as many dog toys available on the market as I wanted. Either way, the rise in wages of the dog toy industry hurts the workers who want to purchase those products. Although Marx admits that it is perfectly true that considered as a whole, the working class spends and must spend its income upon necessaries, a general rise in the rate of wages would, therefore, produce a rise in the demand for, and consequently in the market price of, necessaries, which has been the same argument folks made about the $15 minimum wage and its impact on inflation. However, Marx ultimately concludes that the general rise in the rate of wages would therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit without any permanent change in the price of commodities. I mean, think about it. The employer can't really cut hours. Think of your own work experience. Employers already hire as few employees as possible, wanting them to work as hard as possible for as little pay as possible. In the end, after the dust settles, though a rise in wages may cause a rise in inflation, the rise in wages will ultimately lead to a transfer of wealth from the profits of employers to the wages of employees. But we'll see how all this works going forward. Looking at a previous rise in wages and how that impacted the economy, Marx notes, a rise in the money wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day, a great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the price of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard of progressive expansion of the markets for their commodities. A rise in wages led to a rise in employment and a fall in commodity prices. Basically the exact opposite of what people feared would happen from wage increases. Interesting. To see how this all works, Marx has to explain price and wages and profits and, the labor theory of value and all of that. Comparing the function and use of the labor theory of value to the supply and demand theory of value, Marx states, supply and demand regulate nothing but the temporary fluctuations of market prices. They will explain to you why the market price of a commodity rises above or sinks below its value, but they can never account for that value itself. He continues, at the moment when supply and demand equilibrate each other, and therefore cease to act, the market price of a commodity coincides with its real value, with the standard price around which its market prices oscillate. Basically, the supply and demand of a commodity fluctuates around the commodity's real value. But what determines that real value? Marx states, "Price, taken by itself, is nothing but the monetary expression of value. The value of gold or silver, like that of all other commodities, is regulated by the quantity of labor necessary for getting them." Let's look back at our dog toy example. If the average dog toy is made from rubber dug from the rubber mines by Pa, I have no idea how dog toys are made, and if it's carved by Pa and takes weeks to produce a single toy, then on average, the price of a dog toy will be reflected in that amount of labor put into it. But if the dog toy industry has huge excavation machinery at the rubber mines and huge manufacturing conveyor belts and furnaces and hydraulic presses or whatever the dog toy factory uses, then the average value and therefore average cost of a dog toy will be determined by that level of social labor. And again, as I said in the wage, labor, and capital video, if I take all data producing a dog toy of equal quality to that of a mass-produced dog toy, I won't be able to just claim that it costs more labor and therefore should cost more profit, because this is about the average amount of labor necessary to make the product. If I make a paw-crafted dog toy equaling quality to a mass-produced toy, I will only get mass-produced prices for it. But if it is a paw-crafted, high-quality dog toy that's better than what the mass production machinery can achieve, then the necessary labor needed to make a toy of that quality will be higher, and so its price will be higher. As we saw in the wage, labor, and capital video, Marx again argues that the price of labor power is determined by the cost of production and maintaining of that labor power. But here, Marx adds that the rate of surplus value will therefore depend on the ratio in which the working day is prolonged over and above that extent, by working which the working man would only reproduce the value of his laboring power or replace his wages. But wait, I thought in Wage, Labor, and Capital, Marx argued that wages are paid out from the money the capitalist already has on hand. So how does surplus labor exist when the worker is paid prior to profit being realized? Well, as Marx explains it, on the basis of the wages system, even the unpaid labor seems to be paid labor. Whether a man works 3 days of the week for himself on his own field, and 3 days for nothing on the estate of his lord, or whether he works in a factory or the workshop 6 hours daily for himself and 6 hours for his employer, comes to the same. Although in the latter case, the paid and unpaid portions of labor are inseparably mixed up with each other. And the nature of the whole transaction is completely masked by the intervention of a contract and the pay received at the end of the week. This is the case because, as Marx puts it, profits are made by selling commodities not above, but at their real values. The surplus value, or that part of the total value of the commodity in which the surplus labor or unpaid labor of the working man is realized, I call profit. Rent, interest, and industrial profit are only different names for different parts of the surplus value of the commodity, or the unpaid labor realized in it. Land and capital enable their owners to get their respective shares out of the surplus value extracted by the employing capitalist from the laborer. As I explained before, if I simply buy some rubber, I can't exactly sell that commodity above its real value and make a profit. So I need to hire laborers to work upon the rubber and increase its value by turning that rubber into dog toys, and then I can realize profits by selling those and start the cycle over again. Marx explains it in this way. Since the capitalist and working man have only to divide this limited value, that is, the value measured by the total laboring of the working man, the more the one gets, the less will the other get, and vice versa. Whenever a quantity is given, one part of it will increase inversely as the other decreases. Next, Marx looks at reasons for raising wages or resisting their fall. For example, that wages need to keep up with the increased cost of living. He states, if wages did not rise, or not sufficiently rise to compensate for the increased values of necessaries, the price of labor would sink below the value of labor, and the laborer's standard of living would deteriorate. Basically, workers need to fight for higher wages to compensate for the fact that the capitalist cycle of production creates a disproportionate rise in profits received by the capitalist. thus increasing the inequality between capitalist and worker. Marx adds, the whole history of modern industry shows that capital, if not checked, will recklessly and ruthlessly work to cast down the whole working class to this utmost state of degradation. By increasing the intensity of labor, a man may be made to extend as much vital force in 1 hour as he formerly did in 2.
If you do manage to stock 10 aisles of shelves on a 6-hour shift, perhaps someone who had been stocking 8 aisles of shelves on a shift is now getting their hours slashed because they aren't keeping up with the new standard, the increased level of exploitation.
So, as the cycle of capitalist production and accumulation continues, the capitalist makes still greater and greater profits, exponentially above the wages of the workers. And so, Marx argues that it is the utmost height of folly to demand that while his wages are necessarily affected by the adverse phase of the cycle, he should exclude himself from compensation during the prosperous phase of the cycle. Or as it's said in our modern times, insert tweet about how a good stock market doesn't mean anything for the working class, but a bad stock market means we all lose our jobs. Okay, so the working class needs to fight for higher wages. Now, how will this fight against the capitalist class for higher wages take place? Well, disagreeing with anarchism and even texts like State and Revolution, Marx argues that because capital is economically stronger than labor, the fight between the two will require the state to come in on the side of the workers, and so the workers should fight for state power. Marx states, this very necessity of general political action affords the proof that, in its merely economic action, capital is the stronger side. Marx argues that we should not stand in the way of fights for higher wages, since 99 out of 100 times, the worker is having his portion of wages decrease through inflation, increased production, technological advancement, the boom and bust cycle, etc., etc. And so, instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. Although someone should have told Marx that abolish the wage system is shorter and catchier. Marx concludes the pamphlet stating, I shall conclude by proposing the following resolutions. Firstly, a general rise in the rate of wages would result in a fall of the general rate of profit, but, broadly speaking, not affect the prices of commodities. Secondly, the general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise, but to sink the average standard of wages. Thirdly, trades unions work well as centers of resistance against the encroachments of capital. They fail partially from an injurious use of their power. They fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it, instead of using their organized forces as a lever for the final emancipation of the working class. That is to say, the ultimate abolition of the wages system. So, today we fight for increased unionization and $15 an hour minimum wage. Tomorrow we fight for collectivizing the means of production, destruction of the commodity form, and abolition of the wage system. Well, it's either that or we can watch billionaires buy rocket ships to Mars while the world burns. Conclusion. Well, that about settles it. We've now looked at both pamphlets, Wage, Labor, and Capital, and Value, Price, and Profit. And we've seen that wage labor is when a laborer is purchased as a commodity, selling a portion of their time, energy, life, and labor power, alienating themselves from the task at hand in order to combine raw materials and means of production to create goods and services for a capitalist to sell for profit. Capital is, as Marx stated, raw materials, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence of all kinds, which are employed in producing new raw materials, new instruments, and new means of subsistence. Value is the amount of labor realized, fixed in the added raw materials and capital, creating a good or a service, a commodity. Price is the cost of a good or service, a commodity, that might fluctuate due to trends or popularity or supply and demand, but will ultimately center around the cost of labor. And profit is, as Marx stated, the surplus value, or that part of the total value of the commodity in which the surplus labor or unpaid labor of the working man is realized. And there we have it. I have defined every word that makes up the title of these pamphlets. Or wait, I forgot about the word and. And is a conjunction? It's a connecting word for making a list or... Anyway, leaning back on our dog toy example, it all works like this. If I'm a capitalist who makes my money selling dog toys, I use some of the profits I currently have to buy rubber and other raw materials and update and repair machinery at the factory, and I pay my employees. Now, my raw materials can't be sold for much more than I bought them for, and the machinery itself doesn't add additional value either for the same reason. It only adds more or less value than what I expended by purchasing it or repairing it. So what I need is laborers using labor power, preferably working as hard as possible for as little pay as possible to maximize my profits. These workers produce commodities, in this case dog toys, thus adding value to the rubber and making a commodity that I can sell for more than what I put into creating it, selling it at a profit. Part of that money goes back into the cycle, to buying new raw materials, updating and repairing machinery. A portion of it goes to paying my employees, thus allowing them to buy food, clothes, shelter, and other common necessities so that they can continue to work for me. And a portion goes to expanding my business so that I remain profitable compared to other capitalists in my industry. And lastly, but certainly not least, in fact, definitely not least, in fact, an ever-increasing portion of that money is profits, which are pocketed by me, the dirty, dirty dog toy owning factory capitalist pig. Or dog. And that's how it works. That's how capitalism works, in a nutshell, according to Marx. If you'd like to know more about Marxism, Marx's theories about capitalism, I would highly recommend these two pamphlets. Each one of them only being about 60 pages, they're pretty quick to read. And as I already alluded to, they are great introductions to Marx's more in-depth texts, like Critique of Political Economy and Das Kapital. So if that sounds interesting to you, I'd highly recommend checking out Wage, Labor, and Capital and Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, which is wonderful. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. Gotta love that. You've provided me with a little extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which is really awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
Then come do your share, lend a hand. There is power, working women, working men. When we stand hand in hand, that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand.